Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world, around the country, around the state, around the city. Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Theresa J, Canada. And as always, I have special guests, and all my guests are special, as you know by now. And today's guest is Dr. Diana Naddeo. Dr. Naddeo is an assistant professor currently at Western Connecticut State University and teaches in the MS Counselor Education program in the clinical mental health concentration. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, and she basically has a broad experience working with children, adolescents, and adults doing individual and group therapy. She currently has a private group practice in Newtown, Connecticut, Center for Assessment and Psychotherapy, specializing in child, adolescent, and young adult mental health. And I want to say that I'm just honored to have her because she's a colleague and we've had some time to talk about things. And I said, this is going to be a conversational piece. It's not going to be like a lecture, which we're used to in academia and so forth and so on. So I'm just pleased because I want her to talk about the conversation we're going to have today. Will be about the therapeutic approach used for young children who have experienced trauma. And that's an area that she has some specialty with. So this will tie in, for those of you who know about the podcast, this will tie in with the focus of the podcast, which is around basically school issues and school integration, desegregation issues, and how would this effort impact young children psychologically. So we're going to let Dr. Naddeo, and may I call you Diana, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. That makes it easy for me. So Diana's going to talk about her background and her training and specifically focus in on looking at, the aspect of therapeutic approaches that she has used in her practice and other things that she's done maybe research on related to young children who have had trauma. And then we'll talk a little bit about how I'd like her to talk about how she would think that impacted children who were part of any kind of desegregation effort. So Diana, you want to get started with some of those issues?
Sure, absolutely. So when I think of treatment approaches for children who have experienced trauma, I actually pause and want to first understand, how do we know what the child is experiencing is representative of having had a traumatic event, but actually what ends up coming my way. I do both therapy and comprehensive neuropsych and psych evals, and do a lot of work in the schools with kids who present with various issues. And I'd say that the first step is, it usually isn't the case that the trauma comes in as the presenting problem, but that this other set of symptoms comes in as the presenting problem. And instead of rushing to diagnosis at that consult level, my first step is exploring whether the symptoms are representative of something highly distressing and or traumatizing versus what we get a lot of, which is, right, I think that this is ADHD or anxiety or some blanket statement that somehow, I think culturally, we think of mental health too much like physical health and that there's going to be a label for everything, but it's not a one size fits all approach because we're all so different, right, in our minds. So following doing an identification of what kind of is the distressing event, or usually more than one events that have happened, or identifying a traumatic incident, or what I often see is that cumulative trauma, those smaller in impact, so not a catastrophic trauma. I'm looking for also ways in which things like poor goodness of fit, or a bad fit between the parent and the child, or the child and the school, a highly sensitive child with a very extroverted and at times maybe aggressive or hostile or externalizing type of parent can be distressing enough to cause the same type of traumatic reaction that a child who has been physically abused over time could cause. So we want to be considerate of all the ways in which one experiences something as traumatic. And I like to first conceptualize trauma as something that's not about the event, but that it's any situation that is too much, too fast, too soon.
Okay.
That the child experiences a flooding of emotion, usually distress of some nature, that comes on quickly and that they are left with to deal with alone before they're developmentally ready. And
then do you want to give us an age range, what you're talking about? Can you give us an age range?
I think that I don't know that there's any limits to that age range. Okay. I think that, but we do more see a distressing event turn into something traumatic.
Okay.
When they're younger, right? When we have like a 5-year-old versus a 30-year-old, the 5-year-old is going to more easily experience something as too much, right? Because their nervous system is still developing too quickly. And then without the parental or relational support that they need, because the 5-year-old, right, would not know how to navigate that necessarily. But I think the same thing can happen. I think that there's a larger range within the child and adolescent. So I think that 5 to 18, we could see this happen in the form of the manifestation of symptoms, right, as a result of either a catastrophic trauma, something life or death situation that occurs once, or those shorter spurts of stress that are happening too regularly that then ultimately lead to a traumatic reaction or a post-traumatic reaction. Okay. And I think that the pushes in our field to really be using the evidence-based models to guide our treatment. And while I value the scientific basis for those treatments, I also think it's short-sighted to think of a world that we exist in where we operate and the manualized approach would help us in our psychological functioning. How do I say that differently? That there's
can you tell us that? And for those of us who are listening who are in lay language, who may not be psychologically focused, can you give us an example
of a treatment?
Yes.
So I think that integrative treatment comes to mind. So the evidence-based models would be something like cognitive behavioral therapy for trauma.
Okay.
In childhood. So CBT-T is an example. Play therapy and narrative therapies are also forms of therapy that are used to help people who have experienced trauma. And both of those involve either storytelling through play, which is really helpful for younger children. So the play therapist guides the child in play activities that are structured and help elicit understanding of their internal world. So how does the child play with the two dolls? How are they interacting? Is their communication pleasant? Is it harsh? Is it reenacting a traumatic event that happened to them? So that's similar to a narrative approach, which is more verbal in nature, but the therapist is helping the client narrate or tell the story. They have to add a chapter in their life book about this traumatic event. Because people's initial reaction to trauma tends to be avoidance, suppression, or repression, or moving away from it.
Avoidance behavior, yes.
And it's completely understandable. They're not able, they don't have the capacity to cope either because it's developmentally, they're not ready, or the traumatic event exceeded their capacity to cope. And they're left with emotions that they don't know what to do with. And this is particularly prevalent in younger children and like kind of that.
Let me just interject a point here. This is why I want to interject about your perspective of looking at the situation during the desegregation efforts. And this is basically going back to when you mentioned a doll or something, going back to the clocks, the study of the doll study. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the doll study that was used for the arguments for the Brown versus Board of Education case, where the clocks and their training, their psychologists, both husband and wife, who basically their research looked at showing Black children dolls and asking them in terms of looking at different dolls, and it was a white doll, a Black doll, and their identification and the fact that they showed that based upon what was happening, students they looked at what's the good doll and what's the bad doll. What do you think that does to a child and had done to children? What happens to young children when something like that occurs?
So my understanding of the study is right that are you asking about like the impact that has had on children in terms of
right
Our view of themselves, others, in the world.
Yes, their image. If the society, and this is basically, like I said, this is what was used for the Brown decision to help support the fact that Black children who, in fact, had apparently a negative image of themselves. Okay, and so basically, what does that say? Because so basically, they're saying children. That's why they said if children are looked upon, they feel that way about themselves. Therefore, they're not going to be, they're saying, well, I'm not a good person. I'm a bad person. I mean, they even did recent studies, I think in Italy, and I was sharing this with one of my classes about how the same thing occurred. They had both different, Italian children and Black children who basically look at dolls. And this was like I can't remember what year it was. It was pretty recent, I think. And their impressions still to this day about thinking they're not because this is a societal thing. And so I'm just asking you, what is it that these are children under the age of under the age of 9 and 10. So do you think that made an impact on their lives long term?
Absolutely. Because of the way in which our relationships and how we view people, and I mean our relationships both within ourselves, our intrapersonal relationships and our interpersonal relationships. My philosophy of understanding ourselves and human nature and human behavior is through the lens of relationships heal, but relationships are also what cause distress, impairment, disordered ways of functioning. And so if I have a way in which my racial identity development is skewed by these experiences of how we work in our culture, it's 2025. I like to think that we've made some progress, but we know that white Barbie dolls still dominate and that there is still a lot of catching up to do in terms of integrating all that we know about that area of development and how we talk about it. That is really not there yet. We have not made enough progress. And so we have these situations that aren't as obvious as like the study I'm thinking of, like the brown-eyed kids versus the blue-eyed kids study a long time ago. Like, very obviously it was like horrifying that was even allowed. But we're still in this situation where there is some more discussion, but it's not enough. And I think that what we can do now is not expect at the macro level for all the Barbie dolls and all the corporations and the TV shows and the figures that children see and then that internalize to figure out who they are.
Excellent.
That might not change, but we can have conversations with children.
Right.
Whether teach schools, therapists, understanding and then helping to reframe or re-narrate what their views of themselves are in terms of their racial identity. I think that the discussion of if I am a white therapist working with a Black child, to have that conversation appropriately brought up in the room, in a safe and secure place, that if we can shift to that mindset of not running away from these conversations, but it's like, falls very much in line with how trauma tends to work when I was saying before about holding things in. I think that the experience of seeing yourself as less than or othered in many ways, and going to someone for treatment who has the characteristics you've idealized simply because of what you were taught and was modeled, that we have the power to undo that.
What recommendations would you give to a parent? I know this is, I have a background in parenting stuff. I have research in parenting. What advice would you give to a parent for a young child who has had trauma as a result of situations like in schools and so forth? What would you, what kind of advice or what kind of recommendation would you make?
And you're saying trauma globally?
If you have a child, a parent who wants to have their child to be treated by you, and that child had some trauma within the school systems, okay, and any aspect, what recommendation would you give? What type of therapeutic approach would you take with that particular child?
So I would be started off saying the word integrative. So that to me, first and foremost, is the most important thing to subscribe to. So we need to make sure that we are implementing a therapy treatment that is a good fit for the child, that is going to help repair, right? The events surrounding so you need to find a therapist who doesn't just have a interest in trauma focused work, but that has some, background and expertise. The second thing, and this is what is newer on the field, newer within the field and an up and coming issue, that I'm very passionate about myself, and that is trauma-informed special education.
Oh, describe that. Describe it. I'm familiar. Describe to the audience. Let's hear that.
So, special education, in order to qualify for special education services, a child needs to be found eligible under certain categories. And the ones we're used to, learning disabilities, ADHD can be one, or other health impairment, ADHD, learning disabilities like dyslexia or dysgraphia, or emotional disability. So typically children with trauma who are having trouble in school as a result of that, which I think is never segmented to just a few kids. Like it is, there's no way that they're not impacted in every part of their life, but they're usually put under emotional disability. And as a result, they do not get the specialized trauma-informed types of interventions that they really require in a wraparound way to be able to free them up from the impact of the trauma on their learning. And therefore, their access to the curriculum is so limited. So there's been new legislation, not passed, but it's in the works around including a specific classification for trauma as a category so that we can provide students who present with who present with symptoms related to their traumatic experience or experiences the right kind of services, because we fall short in that way, both therapeutically and at the school level. There's way too much one size fits all and not enough personalization. And I get it. There's a lot of kids and not a lot of resources in the public school system, especially in certain parts of the country, for sure. Right. But if we could slow down and be more personalized, I can guarantee that preventative work will allow for a shorter course of treatment of services, because you're actually targeting what that child needs and you're actually tailoring the plan for them. So I'm speaking vaguely. So I'll give a few examples for at the school level. A child who's experienced trauma, it usually occurs within traumatic experiences in childhood, typically come in the form of a traumatic experience with a caregiver or abuse or neglect. It can come from witnessing domestic violence, right? But again, adult people. It's very people. Mm-hmm. And a relational approach, training of the teachers to be aware of how to respond to a child who, let's say, acts out in class because of their their emotions from the traumatic event. We are not going to set up a reward system with stickers. I mean, to motivate them to behave better. I never really think that's a good idea, but that's not, that will repair it on the surface. But a much better approach would be, how can we get the child to trust the person who's implementing a plan for them? How do we get the child to come to believe that these people are there to help them? That sense of anxiety needs to be reduced. And at the school level, of course, strategies and skills, like coping skills, deep breathing, absolutely part of the plan. The school counseling piece, really important to learn those types of things. But if it's being delivered by people who don't really understand what this child's going through, then it all falls short. So you need to have teacher training in a trauma. I find, not to sound cynical, but the word trauma informed is a buzzword right now. It's super trendy and everyone says it. And I love that it's part of the scene and it's so important. But I want to ask, do you know what that really means? Right? That's rhetorically, I don't know that. And it's fine if it's not understood, but it's our job, if we're going to say we're doing trauma-informed school education or trauma-informed therapy or work, it's got to come with the right credentials. It's got to be immersed. The teachers have to be immersed in a culture of trauma-informed work. So I think that both actually, talking the talk, walking the walk is super important, and also valuing it. And that's something we just hopefully can only hope that we all catch on to it.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Well, thank you for sharing all this information, this knowledge. And I think relating to specifically in education, I think that that's the whole trauma informed. I was just saying, but as you mentioned also, there are some, problems because of resources and so forth and so on. And you talk about not just, the environment they're in, also the teachers and teachers have their hands full already with so many other things they have to do. So I understand the challenges and thank you for sharing the information because I think many of the people who are listening are unaware of all that is entailed with this process. So Dr. Naddeo, we're going to end up here. I just want to thank you for providing that knowledge and your expertise dealing with, trauma and your experiences with young children, especially, and how it impacts not just them, but our whole society. Because of course they grow up and they live in our society. So we want to be able to start at an earlier stage as opposed to a later stage. And I think I'll have you back on. We'll talk about some other things if you don't mind. But I just want to thank you for being with us today. So thanks so much for being here. And we'll look forward to hear you again about all the expertise that you have, especially as I have us focus in on. We'll talk about some parenting issues. We'll move into that the next stage. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Definitely.
Okay. Thank you. So everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters. And we hope you'll come back and listen to some more. Have a great day wherever you are around the world, around the country, around the city, around the state. And we'll see you next time.